Welcome, Annalyn Connor. Thanks so much for spending some of your afternoon with us. Tell us a little bit about how you came to get involved in space, or particularly why you're choosing aerospace engineering at UCF.
Yes, thank you for having me. So yes, I'm doing aerospace, my undergraduate at UCF, and I grew up in Orlando my whole life, so I was always used to hearing the sonic booms and watching launches as if it, was normal. And my grandfather actually he built airplanes in his garage, and he was very inspirational for me to want to pursue aerospace. And when I started at Exolith a little over a year ago now at Exolith Lab, we make high fidelity lunar, asteroid, and Martian simulants. It is funded by UCF's Center for Lunar and Asteroidal Surface Science. So once I started there as a simulant engineer, crushing rocks, crushed mostly basaltic rock, bronzite, olivine. Once I got into the door of the space industry, I had no idea, about the projects that I was going to be working on. I had no idea that I was going to fall in love with research and be able to, have the opportunity for these projects. So I think that other than my grandfather, it was really just Exolith for giving me the opportunities to do these projects. So many doors have opened because of that. From just starting as a simulant engineer and doing production to being hired on as a lab engineer, and then coming to them and being like, I want to be more involved in this regolith. I know how to make it. Now I want to apply it and I want to benefit science. So that's kind of where my love for that has blossomed, definitely in the past couple of months for sure.
Okay. Quick question. Did you start at Exolith before you became a freshman at UCF, or were you a student and then learned about Exolith?
It was I transferred to UCF during the pandemic. So my first year was just online. When I started actually going in person, I was part of a club called SEDS. It's a space club. And they said, hey, Exolith is hiring. So my first semester back, I applied. And that's probably one of the greatest advices that I could give somebody, is to get a job or do some sort of research in school. Working at a lab is perfect. So the very first public encounter I wanted at UCF, which I guess could be like my first year, but I had done a lot of my undergraduate classes at Valencia, a community college.
Right. Yeah, that's not too far away. So you found out through an organization, through SEDS. It's a school-based organization, right? So when you're there, like your first year, advice-wise for students there, would you suggest, do you just get involved in as many as possible organizations, or do you kind of stay focused on one area of interest?
There's a lot of clubs and it could be overwhelming. SEDS, for instance, is a very, very big organization, very big club. It's a huge student body. And I actually got more into the clubs that are more like intimate and work on projects together, multiple projects. So I actually am the vice president of the radio club now at UCF. We started back a little less than a year ago, actually, and doing projects with them. I don't think you should overwhelm yourself with too many clubs, but if you find that group that you get along with and get stuff done, that's probably the best.
You mentioned research, right? That you had kind of started out with this love of research. Can you describe for our listeners what that means if you're doing research as a student, and maybe is that where you came up with your ideas for your current work that you're doing?
Right. When I was working production and crushing rocks and sieving to the different particle sizes, the whole time I was thinking, brainstorming, what can we do with these simulants to benefit science? And I went up to my manager at the time, who's a biologist, and he does plant study at the Exolith, and I said, do you think this is a good idea? And he said, yeah, why don't you go ahead and see if there's any other papers about worms interacting in regolith. And so a lot of research involves reading and involves having to, dive into, this Google Scholar or whatever.
Right out what's already been written to find out where you can diversify a little bit, right? Is that
Right. So
Right. Before we jump into your current research, I wanted to circle back to SEDS. I believe we interviewed Sarah Alvarado. Is she, do you know her? I believe she was a grad student at UCF, and she's one of the national officers. Are you familiar with that
I
name?
have heard of her. I don't know if she might have graduated or not, but
she did. I think she did, because now you have a new lead there, but that's how we came to know SEDS. I know it's like a nationally recognized organization. So
yeah.
When you said you worked with radios, do you mean like radio astronomy or like amateur
I think it's
band,
broadcasting, right?
amateur band radio?
Amateur radio, correct.
Oh, that's cool.
So I will tell you this, that I bought a kit years ago from a UCF professor named JD Mukherjee, who runs Florida Space Grant, and we could listen to Jupiter. Jupiter emits radio waves that certain times of the year you can pick up. That was always a really fun project, to put these really long antennas in the yard and listen for the radio emissions
Don't
of
you have
Jupiter.
Students who are doing like ham stuff? Isn't that kind of the same thing?
We do have to, you
Yeah.
do have to have a amateur radio license if you want to talk directly to the satellites. So I do have a couple of students that have done that in
ham
the past.
radio.
Are you a amateur radio license operator?
Yes, I can operate up to the 12 band or the 10 band. I just have my technician right now.
So maybe you should share for our listeners what your call sign is. So if they run into you out there on the radio.
Yeah, my call sign is KQ4DJX.
KQ4DJX. All right.
Mhm.
Cool. So let's get to your current research. I'm really excited. I know Kevin knows a lot about it because he's already talked with you about it. So worms, right? And the idea of, and I was like reading the bio, and I was like, you're taking excrement, right? And you're basically going to utilize the worms to kind of turn that into something else. And we had a student who was looking at bacteria, right? It was Arnav's paper was on bacteria doing the same thing in space.
Awesome.
Tell us a little bit about what your research with worms is doing.
And I want to add, before you start talking about your research, give us the listeners some background on earthworms and how they what they consume, the detritus and how they normally operate, and how you're manipulating that for aerospace purposes.
Correct. So there's a lot of research with bioremediation for worms that could also be applied to regolith, and people are also working with genetically modifying worms to eat plastics and metals, like I think what you mentioned.
Yeah.
Same can also be applied with our regolith. For example, MGS, our Martian regolith, has 25% epsonite, 25% salt content, and it also has iron oxide rust. So if we can get these worms to, sort of acclimate to this environment, which worms do a great job with acclimating to harsh environments. So the earthworms that I am studying is just the red wiggler earthworms. They're very popular compost worm. When I was doing my research, there's hundreds and hundreds. I wanted to specify, just focus on one worm for now. And I wanted to say, okay, my objective was to see how well that their worm castings can affect the regolith. So instead of just adding worm castings like a lot of gardeners do, how can we condition and fertilize the regolith, because it's so barren, it lacks so many plant hormones. And I guess for my mission statement as a student is I care very much about sustainability. So this cycle with worms, it completes the whole circle per se. That astronauts, of course, the future astronauts for a lunar or Martian base, they're going to have to excrete some waste. And if we can put that into food for our worms that we put into, our crops, it's just a complete cycle. So red wiggler worms are actually neither male or female, which is cool. You could just put two worms in there and they will reproduce. So you don't really have to worry about male, female. They also breathe through their skin. So I think that having good monitoring good humidity levels and temperature levels, you don't want to make it too much water in the air because it can affect them. They are also self-limiting, so they will reproduce up to the size of their container. So we're not going to have an overflow of worms, which is great. I did have that question, like, oh, what if the worms
It's like
escape?
a horror movie, right?
I know, I was like, no.
They take over.
Well, I was thinking that they might be a food source, right? I only know them because as a kid we used them as
Mealworms.
fish bait a lot. No, she's
No.
talking about
No, I know she's talking about something else, but I was
like
thinking about food wise
like
too.
Oh, you're exactly right about the fish worms. Those are the exact worms that we're using.
they're very active when they are on the hook.
Yes.
So
They wiggle. That's why they're called red wigglers.
are they like that when you handle them in the lab, just in general? Just any kind of disturbance really agitates them?
Some of them are more chill, but yeah, if you poke them a certain way, they'll start flopping around.
Now, are you looking at maybe at a microscopy level what's happening to the? Now you make this regolith, and it's known for having these really nasty shapes that are not.
Correct.
They stick to things like photovoltaics and spacesuits and equipment in general, and in lungs, right? You don't want to inhale it, but are you noticing, are you at the point in your research where you're looking at how does the worm affect the shape of the molecules?
That definitely has a lot to do because usually the soil on Earth is usually round or whatever. A lot of like civil engineering or geoscientists, they look at the micro level of these soils, and they're usually round, but the reality to it is that on the lunar surface it's very jagged, it's very crystalline. So that's definitely what we show because we want we want the best simulating for our regolith. So it definitely they're got to be acclimating to their stomach. Their guts are probably, I don't want to say shredded, but it's probably they're not having the best time, especially in MGS. But because I'm doing Lunar and Martian with a Earth control as desert silver sand. Some researchers have used desert silver sand as a proxy for Martian analog, and I've been doing that.
Are you using like a Highland simulant or a Maria, a darker simulant?
I'm using the Highlands right now. I have a feeling that the Mare would actually be a little bit better. The Lunar Mare simulant is doing better in the growth studies as well, because it has more, I think, basaltic rock. It has definitely a lot more basaltic rock, but there's something in it that is making it a little bit easier.
You can't just put worms in this simulant and them survive, right? You've got to give them some
eating? They have to
some sort of spike some nutrients in there, right? How does that work?
So in Florida, there's a bunch of ranches here. So I tried to go to and reach out to some farmers that would be willing to give me some of their animal waste as a proxy for astronaut secretion. So actually I've been using horse manure that I've been hot composting, and so once you collect the manure, you can't just feed it to them like that. It has to go through some hot composting level to kill any bacteria, mostly like any bugs that can lay in the waste. And after I successfully hot composted, which took about 2 months, that was my worm food.
So so the bacteria, I'm thinking they're already decomposers in it when you get it, and they are attacking they're degrading the organics in the manure at some point. Do you have to dehydrate it? Do you care about the water level? You're just going to mix it with the regolith, right? How and why just horse, right?
Let me piggyback because he's kind of taking my questions here while I'm thinking about it. So I don't know a lot about manure, clearly, right? But we had a garden growing up, and we would always prefer the cow manure to the horse manure because we were told that the horse manure would burn the crops if you put that on. So my question, I guess, piggybacking off of his, and you can just add to that, would be whether or not human, feces would be more similar to one versus the other.
And you're correct. I should be using cow or some other, or even goat manure over horse. They were just horses were
That
so
was
much
what was
they
available.
were easier to find.
Yeah.
But you're right, there's a bunch of grains that they don't digest, and so there's a bunch of, hay and stuff are like in it already,
Right.
which doesn't really associate with our waste. So a cow would be better. Which when I start my research, because I'm gonna be getting a grant to fund it. I've been turning this compost by hand when I could just get like a compost tumbler.
Right, like one of those big tumblers, right?
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. So I've been applying for grants for that, and when I do get that, my next batch will be definitely a better source of worm food, even though the worms love the horse.
That's interesting to see, like, how it'll be interesting to see the comparison.
Yeah, and what percentage
be
of
interesting.
soil, what's your golden ratio right now for the optimal health of your worms? As far as like the regolith and the manure, what's the percentage? Or is that proprietary?
Yeah, this is my first batch, my first research. So this is kind of like preliminary at the moment. So this is kind of like a test to see if they even can survive, which they have survived. I started almost 3 months ago on August 30th. So on the 30th of November, in a couple days, we're actually going to be collecting the soil and doing analysis on how much organic content is in there, NPK analysis just to see how much nitrogen, how much potassium, phosphorus is in the soil. So that would be really interesting to find out. But at first I started a 1-to-1 ratio by volume, because the densities of the worm food, and I'm just going to say worm food just because it sounds better.
Then poop. I know.
Exactly.
Okay. You're an aerospace engineer,
Well,
so you
Right.
you can use manure.
No,
if
but
you
at
need
one of
to.
the conferences we were just at recently, someone was talking about how we would handle excrement there, and they were talking about poop, and I thought, great, even in science we can think about eating our
Love
own
it.
poop eventually.
Awesome.
It might be interesting as your research progresses to see if the worms could affect the off-gassing of that might be an interesting area, because when we get up there in those contained atmospheres, right, we have to be very conscious about gases that are liberated intentionally or unintentionally. So that might be an interesting area. In my mind, I think that would be interesting too, is do the worms affect off-gassing, or are the worms responsible?
Do you want to explain that for our listeners who might not know?
Well, when we build a spacecraft, we're very concerned about off-gassing, right? When something gets in a vacuum, it evolves. Things like adhesives are notorious, like glues and cements and things. So you have to be conscious, because if you're building a spacecraft and you're flying with something with a lens, you don't want something volatile to evolve from your vehicle and then be deposited on the lens of a very expensive telescope, for instance. But also when you're with humans, we always are concerned about what gases are we producing in the air that someone has to breathe, when there is not an option to roll the window down and get some fresh air. So
that might reduce some of those kind of.
I don't know. See, it's just a fundamental research question, right? Do earthworms affect off-gassing of decomposing biological materials? That's just like fundamental question. We don't know. So somebody will get a PhD out of something like that.
Right. And I hope that biology and chemistry students can piggyback off of this research and do more with this.
It's the most interesting application for an aerospace engineer.
Oh yeah,
I think
yes, it is.
You're sort of in the realm of ecless, right? And when you use that really nice word, bioremediation, right? That's somebody. These are important issues as we live in space, right? How do we deal with waste, or more importantly, how do we grow food on the moon? That's going to be eventually we have to quit shipping things, right? And have you thought about? And I know you're an undergrad, but have you thought about, if you had to decide what sort of job would be optimal right now when you stepped out into the working world, what do you think that would be? Or do you feel like you're a researcher?
That's such a difficult question, because I dream of having working on some instrument that's going to space, but I think research is such a fundamental, and I think I'm learning so much from this as well. And I'm also applying, in the future, I want to be able to have a self-automated system for my worms. I want to be able to study them in microgravity. So if I'm applying, electronics and other, chemistry and other applications to my worms and grow as much knowledge, I think my dream job would just be some way of affecting the earth and sustaining the earth while also wanting to explore and terraform other airless bodies. It is a difficult question. I just am kind of seeing where this takes me and where my education takes me.
So you mentioned sustainability, right? And then you were just talking about how, and I know that from looking at your bio that's of incredible importance to you. How does the research that you're currently looking at, how would it possibly also impact Earth here as well?
So that's one of my big things is, how can we use this technology that we're applying to exploration of other airless bodies and all of this space technology? How can we apply this to Earth? So I don't really know how vermiculture has, it's already affected Earth. It's everywhere. And that's just one composting system out of a lot that we've come across. And even, we don't even have to use the regolith on the moon, but it's there. So I feel like the sustainability route would be to use it and find a way to create some sustainable agricultural ecosystem.
Especially without our current methods have depleted the soil.
Right. You see, our methods are not working here on
Not
Earth.
at all.
First of all, first time I've ever heard the word vermiculture used, which I think is a nice word. I presume that's the worms involved with agriculture, right? Exactly. But here's one thing I'm thinking is we have a lot of soil that is not suitable, or a lot of the surface of the earth is not suitable for growing crops. For instance, I think about like high deserts, for instance.
Immediately going there, correct.
Places where you don't have a lot of erosion, you don't have a lot of organics in the soil. Maybe those can be, out of necessity, for us having to feed so many billions of people, we may have to take places that could not grow food and try to transform them into places we could grow food. So that seems like one potential application of your research.
Now, as we are getting a little bit closer to the end, I don't want to leave without asking you a little bit about what other areas of research you're currently looking at, or that you might be interested in undertaking.
With the Radio Club, we are actually working on, they're calling it a LunaSat. It's basically a chipsat that's going to be launched to the moon, hopefully in October of next year. And that's through the University of Boulder. So I am a lead on that. And 212 of these teams were picked to code and assemble this chipsat. So hopefully they'll actually be landing on the moon and collecting this data. And obviously, since I'm part of the Radio Club, I want to be able to communicate with it. So that's something that's really cool. Also, I'm working on some small STTR projects involving compaction of the regolith and using it to supply roadways and landing pads on the moon. Compaction is the most cost-effective way of creating roadways. So I've been investigating that and the porosity and different, mixtures and test compaction using that. So very broad, very broad
that's great.
projects going on there.
Yeah, you're right now. If you end up with a PhD, I see it in one of two lanes, right? Planetary science, or really material, the mineralogy of other bodies, or some sort of astrobiology or exobiology. I definitely see you in one of those two lanes. Is your chipset going to soft land on the surface of the moon because of its low mass? It'd be able to survive impact. And do you have some kind of decentralized way that those chips are going to talk to an orbiting, like, is it got like a mother CubeSat that's going to deploy them, or how will you get data from the moon from something so small that probably doesn't have a lot of, it's definitely not got any wattage on its transmitter. So how will
Right.
you recover that data?
It's like the size of a Post-it note, and what the University of Boulder, this is their project. What they made it seem like was that they're hopefully going to land, and they haven't really told us any way of how they're going to communicate to it. It sounds like we have to go through University of Boulder to communicate with it. They haven't really specified, they haven't said anything about a mother satellite or anything like that. I don't even know if all the satellites will be able to communicate together with each other. I don't even know really about that. This is really just a workshop to get people excited for space, to say, oh, this is what this chipsat looks like. This is how to code it, talk to it, and it's kind of just like it's kind of just like we want people to get involved and
Right.
learn about it and be more hands-on with it.
Right,
Well,
right.
the labs at Boulder are very well known for very high quality aerospace engineering. So they're a premier institution. And there's some federal labs there in Boulder as well. I think about Enroll, the national. There's a lot of brain power there in Boulder. A lot of smart faculty. So I'm sure they'll work that out. And it does sound like it's a program meant to engage students to do hands-on engineering. So that definitely. And they did try to launch a chipsat, a couple of chipsats where a 3U CubeSat would launch, and it would sling out, 100 little stamp size chipsats that were going to talk to the CubeSat. Then the CubeSat would speak to the ground, because else it seems like the power requirements would be tough. That's a long way on a very small,
They're using a solar panel as a power source. Because the lithium battery, I guess, is too heavy.
Well, of course, and when your chip lands, right, wherever it lands, you might have up to 2 weeks of darkness, at a time, and then 2 weeks of daylight. The lunar day-night cycle is not what we're used to here on Earth. So you want to probably get data when you're in the sunlight, and then it probably will die. It'll either die or it'll definitely be dormant, obviously, when it's nighttime.
So when they say 2 Earth days, that it'll be there, I guess that's equivalent to 56 lunar days. Do you know what days would be dark and what days would be light?
So I think it depends on where you are on the surface of the moon, right? What your latitude and longitude is, right? I know that there's the dark side of the moon doesn't even exist. It's just the part of the moon that happens to be facing us during the moon, right? We just don't see it. It's when it's facing the Earth. But I'm not an expert on the lunar calendar. I just know that in our work, when we're working on a rover, the older kids on my team are, you want to get all your work done. You want to time your landing so you're at the front end of the 2 Earth weeks of daylight if you're in a middle latitude. And then you either have to have some serious power systems to survive, because it's 400 degrees difference in daylight and darkness on the moon. So it's ridiculously cold in the shadows or on the lunar night. So, but I'm really glad that we interviewed you today, because you're an aerospace engineer with a very seemingly diverse set of interests, but they are intricately tied to crewed and human exploration of space.
Well, and just getting started too. That means that you still have many opportunities that will come your way that will help you to kind of choose that path. So that's really exciting. Normally we close out by asking any advice that you have. I know you gave us some earlier. You're welcome to include, but I'd also like maybe if you could share out as our final question, maybe some important lessons that you've learned as an engineering student in your first few years. So wherever you want to take that.
Yes, I think that the best thing for you to do as a student is to say that you don't have to be the best at everything to try something. you don't have to have a radio license to come to radio club. I'm studying worms and I'm an aerospace engineer, right? So I think that, if you have a great idea, if you're given an opportunity, I definitely go for it. If not you, then who's going to fill that space, right? So, I was so nervous going to my first space club meeting, at SEDS. I didn't talk to anybody my first time, and I still said, I'm going to go message her on, Discord. I'm going to go, message this person. So just put yourself out there and try it, and what's the worst thing that could happen, right? So I think that's what I would say.
Well, we really appreciate your time, and we look forward to maybe talking with our kids a little bit about what you do. I know that especially when we have, girls getting involved in STEM stuff, that really is inspirational to some of our students as well. So we really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll be asking you offline to come and speak to the Wolfpack by Zoom, if that's okay. We meet Thursdays at 6. I'll even invite the Space Club kids to join for that. Normally they have separate meetings, but I'd love for have you to share your research, your interests, and what are some of the advantages of being an undergrad engineering student at a great school like UCF.
Yeah.
Yes, I would love to do that, Kevin. I love talking with younger kids, and I think you and I agree both that they are definitely shaping our future for space exploration.
Well, we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.